Mama, will you turn it around? I'm on my cell phone now. Got to say you sit down for this. You should sit down. We have your family here. Maybe you should sit down. I don't wanna sit down. Ooh. This is an emergency.
Okay, so hello and welcome everybody. This is Start Our Shift. So this is how I'd like to call it, the first step in a long journey to what we hope to achieve. Now, a lot of us will have had many conversations over maybe the past 2 months with friends, with strangers on Facebook about the current crisis which we're seeing in terms of race. Sparked essentially in America by, first of all, by the killing of George Floyd, the murder of Breonna Taylor, and also the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, and not to forget the incident in the park with Amy Cooper, where where this woman tried to, in a sense, weaponize her position as a white woman, as a threat to call the police on a man in the park. And like myself, so many of us have been affected and touched by this and hurt by these instances, which has led us essentially to set up this platform so we can move forward with the issues which we face here in the UK. Now, I want to introduce you to Nafdal Zinyemba, who actually, this project is a creation which stemmed from his heart. So I want to bring Nafdal Zinyemba to just give a few words on why he decided to spark this.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Now it was an interesting conversation because it was at the height of everything, where I think I called you, I called Abs, I called Pastor Max, and I was like, guys, like what next? Like, everyone is talking about this, everyone's having conversation, everyone's hashtagging, but what are we actually going to do after this? Because most of the time when things like this happen, it just becomes a conversation, everyone is outraged, and no one does anything about it after. So we kind of sat down and thought, okay, we need to do action. We need to do something that's going to be effective. We need to do something that's going to that we're going to use in order to face the injustice and in order to agitate these systems which are currently causing injustice to everybody, basically. So that's kind of a little bit of a taste of why we started this whole movement.
Okay, thank you for that. And just before we move into the first part of our conversation, which will be with Dr. Gifford Rhamie, Nafta, how have you been? Some of your thoughts, your reflections on these past few months. Like, how have you felt?
Honestly, it's been very, very traumatic. And I know most of us can testify to this, that it's been a very stressful time for all of us, because there's always that why. Mm-hmm. Why is it happening? Why is this happening, especially to us? And we're always seeking answers And right now I've been reading a book about facing trauma, racial trauma, not just any kind of trauma, just racial trauma, and trying to rehabilitate myself to come to a sense of me accepting myself as a young Black man. And I think all of us, some of us here can resonate this. How about you, Troy?
I think you probably know more than anyone. To sum it up, I think one day I called Nafta and was like, Nafi, just make me laugh. Like I just need to laugh. I can't even like remember like the amount of times where I've just cried, like just from, and not even because I've been watching, even like down to things which I want to watch on Netflix. I haven't wanted to watch anything which deals with race, which deals with injustice, because I would either just feel the hurt more, or feel the anger more, or feel the pain even more. And to be honest, I just want to stop feeling that pain. It's even though like I'm smiling here, I'm sniggering about it. It's not because it's funny, but because it's just ridiculous and tiring.
And I think what's important as well to note about that conversation that we had on the phone, we both couldn't laugh.
No.
That was the most painful thing. I think if people know me and Troy on live and people on the panel, we like to laugh and joke together. I think that's one of the most honest times in our relationship, when we've both said, like, this is not even, we can't even laugh anymore. And that just shows just how traumatic this past few months have been for us. So yeah.
And
I think, sorry, Troy, before I let you continue.
I was about to ask Abigail how you've been feeling as well.
Before we even talk about me, I think as Black men, how has it really affected your view of your place in society?
Well, so for me, strangely enough, what it's led to me doing is to be a louder and stronger advocate for the support of Black women as well. Because what I've seen from a lot of Black men, and even me, probably more at the start of the crisis, you know, we sometimes look over the Sandra Blands and the Breonna Taylors and just focus on the injustice which has happened to Black men. But if we, like with the hashtag Black Lives Matter, engulfed in that is really all Black Lives Matter. So for me as a Black man, it's made me to reconsider not only how I treat my black brothers, but also my Black sisters as well. Because what I found is that sometimes when it came to sharing a petition or something like that, when it was a Black woman, for some reason I wasn't as quick to share them as I was when it came to a Black man. So I really had to catch myself and check myself, like, Troy, like, what's going on here? So it's led me on the journey to be a strong advocate for the protection of Black women.
And I think Troy is right, because what I was thinking about as well when Troy was speaking was about the whole essence of intersectionality, how this whole Black Lives Matter it's not just about Black men, it's about different sections in our community which cover Black women, which cover our children, which cover what's that word? Class, which cover the aspects. And I think it's really agitated me. And I'm like, you know what? I need to do something. I can't just sit in the background and send a couple tweets, send a little couple Instagram pics, and then go back to sleep. I was thinking, this is not enough. This is a time where we're supposed to, I'm going to say the word fight. This is a time where we fight for the individuals who are marginalized in our communities, and to fight the systems, not just to fight the systems. So yeah, I see Gifford is smiling when I said fight. When your mentor is smiling at a word you're using, you know you've used the word. What about you, Abs? as a black young woman?
I think so often we see the black women on the front line. And I think for me, it was a case of, I know I have a purpose statement that I live by, and it's to walk boldly, live lovingly, to pursue on purpose and be at peace with myself and others. And for me, it's been a case of, you know what, I still have to walk boldly, regardless of the fact that what's happening around me, I do not like. I have to walk boldly into situations, whether that's walking boldly into my workplace and speaking up in there, or walking boldly into my church setting and speaking up in there, or in my friendship group. But then the second part of my purpose statement is to live lovingly. And how am I meant to live lovingly when the people that are killing the people that I love are still people? They're still children of God. They're still human. They're no different in their physicality aside from possibly the color of their skin. So for me, it's been like wrestling with those two, and how is my purpose connected to this situation? What am I meant to do with my purpose in this time? And then the last element is be at peace with myself and others. And that kind of connects with the live lovingly. How am I meant to be at peace with a situation that is so far from peaceful? And I was reminded earlier this year that the journey to peace is not peaceful. And I have to be content with knowing that I am doing my part to pursue peace and to gain justice in pursuing my purpose and in living lovingly and in walking boldly. But it's a journey, and I can't do it by myself. And so I have to enlist and pull on the strength of others who have gone before me and use their example, and pull up those who are coming after me and ensure that they are coming into a system and a situation and a society that looks better for them based on the work that me and those who've gone before me have done. So that's for me why I'm here and why I'm so involved and passionate about ensuring that we achieve equity, equality, and justice.
Wow.
Yeah, I was really taken back by your mission statement and your power statement. And I'm just interested, just as we just reflect for a moment longer, to Gifford, how would you sum up your thoughts of these last few months?
It's an interesting time. It's something that I've never anticipated. And the combination of that with the lockdown, I think, has fueled a conscientizing nation across the Atlantic, but I call it the North Atlantic Alliance. You know, you will see why I would say that. I say that later. This conscientizing has been good for the nations, and the pandemic, the viral pandemic, really served as a precursor to the real pandemic, which is racism, and it required that, I think, to open up the problem of racism amongst us in a way that we have not seen before. So in many ways, unanticipated, but nevertheless welcome, because I have heard conversations in corridors, on social media platforms that I've never before. In workplace, there is ongoing discussions on how we can transform that environment. So I think essentially it's almost a blessing in disguise.
Thank you for that, Gifford. So without further ado, we'll get into our program as Anthea and Abigail just discreetly walk into the backstage of this stream. So actually, I think what I'll do first, actually, for those of you who don't know Gifford, I'll read out some of his bio. Now, if I was to read every single thing which he has done, I think my mom would call me and tell me I'm not doing enough. So I'll try and capture the highlights. So Dr. Gifford Rhamie, he is a senior lecturer in biblical and pastoral studies at Newbold College, and for some of his own personal studies, or some of the areas where he emphasizes, is he likes to explore how cultural studies could aid with interrogating and displacing Eurocentrism and anti-blackness in biblical studies. And I think you'll certainly hear a bit more on that front in the rest of our conversation. So, involved in other things which Dr. Gifford Rhamie specializes in is drawing on post-colonial theory, whiteness theory, diaspora and pilgrimage studies, and critical conviviality. I can never say that word. When I first saw it in your thesis, I had to Google most of the words, but into critical conviviality to explore racialized discourse and interpretation in Second Temple, Afro-Asiatic Judaism, and early Christianity. So you'll certainly hear a lot more of what Gifford has to say through the rest of this. So to start off, I want to ask, so one of the things which has emerged from this time, you would have seen debates about statues, whether they should be up, whether they should be taken down. One side of the argument is, given England's the empire and what it represents for many minorities, there's people who want the statues taken down, but on the other side, there are people who want the statues up because of what they represent of the British Empire. So it's kind of like seeing two sides of the same coin. So I was just curious to ask then, given these two very different views of how people view, essentially view the British Empire, how does Imperial Britain and its ideologies contribute to upholding racism as a structure in the modern time?
Thank you for that, Joy. It's interesting that you should start the question off with respect to the toppling of statues. We have a friend who was very angry at the toppling of statues when Carston's statue came down, was taken down in Bristol, for example. He was angry. He used to serve in the armed forces, and he said he fought for this country, he fought for our history, and we are taking our history apart. And Troy, this may come as a surprise to you, but when I was 12 and 13, growing up in London, I would have said the same thing.
Yeah,
I would have said, and the question is why? And the reason is because of the myth of the Great Britain that we have all bought into. We must always remember that a nation builds solidarity around its union through the composition of myths, and they have to narrativize those myths in order to create a cohesive unit and understanding within that nation, and that's how we have nationalism, for example. So Britain is no exception to that. Yes.
So what does that mean then? How it's created? Could you break that down a bit more?
Yeah. So that's what I was going about to do. Essentially, before racism ever came, and in the Bible, for example, there's only one race. The Bible conceptualizes the ideology of one race, and that is the human race. And in many ways, Britain, in its disparate parts, were committed to that in let's say 1500 years ago, 2000 years ago, in its inception. And but in order to acquire the wealth that it saw elsewhere, in lands like Africa, in the Caribbean, in South America, they had to create the concept of race. And the concept of race basically is that there's a hierarchy of races where you got and the race bottom, and all the other races in between. So this idea of race was constructed in order to create an ideology of white superiority. And we actually see evidence of that from about the 14th century and the 15th century and the 16th century through art, through descriptions of Queen Elizabeth I. We see descriptions of that through when Pope, I think it was Pope Nicholas, he in the mid 1400s decided as a way of combating the force of the Ottoman Empire, which was a dark black empire. Remember the Africans took a hold of or controlling Spain and Portugal for some 800 years. In order to push them back and force them back, he created the idea of Europe and whiteness. In 1452, he actually wrote a bull or an edict saying that we need to galvanize ourselves as Europe to fight this great enemy, the Ottoman Empire. And that's where we find the evolution of whiteness. And so that by the time Columbus, when he got lost on the Atlantic and found himself accidentally on the so-called New World in America, and he saw the indigenous people of America, in his mind was already pregnant the idea of white superiority. And his view was, I need to win over this country, this land, because these people are inferior to us. We need to civilize them, and by civilizing them, we can take their land, and so on and so forth. But what's interesting with that, Troy, is that could never have happened without the church. So on the one hand, you've got the nation moving forward, but on the other hand, you've got the church literally arm locked. So if you can imagine, the missionaries are out there with the mercenaries, and the missionaries is doing their thing. The mercenaries are doing their thing. The missionaries are praying for the mercenaries. They come back at the end of the day over a cup of tea, and we'll talk about a cup of tea maybe later on, and to see how things are going. And literally, this is how the enslavement of Africans happened under those circumstances, and how that transitioned into colonialism. So we must never think of empire as some political abstract thing that the secular society was involved in. No, it was the church arm locked involved in this. And this was because the church had bought into this ideology of white supremacy. So when we talk about the Church of England, who is the head of the state? The head of the state is the head of the Church of England. How does that happen? That's not coincidental. This didn't happen yesterday. This is centuries and centuries of years old. Another factor is Britain was never, ever a country. It was never a nation. So this was a surprise to everybody. In 1707, for example, when Britain came together with Scotland and said we want to form a union called Great Britain. Before that, England did the same thing with Wales. England and Scotland were already empires. They had colonies. And they had mission statements in England sending out the missionaries to these colonies. So we're talking about empires coming together to become a great Britain of empire. Now, what does that do to people's psychology? What does that do to people's thinking? As I told you, as a 12-year-old, I would have bought into the same ideology or myth as this friend of ours bought, and he's a big grown-up man with grown-up kids. And I would have bought into that, all right? But why is that? What is because there is something when we tie our emotions to the mythical narrative of the nation, it becomes part of our ideology, and it becomes part of our emotional attachment. And so even though we have not looked at the names of these statues as we're walking by, and we don't times, we say, well, that's us. That's part of our history. That's part of Great Britain. Not realizing that the very setting up of these statues was to celebrate the enslavement of Africans, was to celebrate the rape and pilferage of land and people of these lands. And that's etched in not only in the memory of the nation, but it's etched in the heart of the nation. So when we have the red poppies in November and we commemorate World War II, that's really a euphemism for commemorating Great Britain. I can say a lot more there, but I know you want to come in with something.
That's right. So so then when we see people in their droves, not just passionately, but I guess in some cases violently defending these statues, it's more than the name which is etched on there. It's more than the dates. It's more than even what that individual represents. It's the whole history of Britain, which is kind of like being defended in a sense by these people.
Absolutely. And what's interesting, therefore, when you say that, is that it's more than just interpersonal relationships. Of course, that's part of it. But what we're talking about is something that's systemic, something that's written in the DNA of the superstructure of what Great Britain means. All right.
So one of the things which you mentioned previously, which is written into the DNA, you mentioned like the concept of whiteness and supremacy, which was pushed forward partially by the church and the mercenaries. Can you clarify what you mean by that concept of whiteness and exactly how colonialism drove that forward?
Yeah. So whiteness is, as I hinted at, whiteness was emerged as an ideology in the 14th, 15th, and 16th century, and when it was first concretized as a term, it was concretized as a term in order to distinguish Europeans, especially Northern Europeans, from Black people. So there was no concept of white before. All right. Yes, there was concept of fair and dark. That was part of the formation of white and black. Yes, in the Bible and in the early Christianity and in other religions, you do have white purity symbolizing purity and black symbolizing evil. Incidentally, you don't really see that in the Bible. The Bible says, though your sins be as, it doesn't say black.
Scarlet.
Though your sins be as red as scarlet, it shall be as white as snow. So this whiteness is contrasted with redness, if you like, or scarlet. Right? Now, but however, very soon after, in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries, the idea of sin and righteousness or morality was twinned with notions of color. All right. So we can say that really this was the seedbed of what came much later on in terms of whiteness. So when we talk about whiteness, it is an ideology that people rally around to assert that the white race basically is superior to all other races, and inherent in that white race is the virtues of rationalism, the virtues of intelligence, the virtues of invention and scientific invention, and so on. And all of that, of course, was predicated on the Greco-Roman civilization. So suddenly, Greco-Roman civilization was co-opted into this whiteness as being the, again, if I might use that term, seedbed of what we have today. Now, of course, if you know anything about anthropology, especially ancient anthropology, these people were, the Greeks and the Romans were not themselves white, No. Nevertheless, just like, the statues that we see, all the statues that we see from the Greco-Roman period, they're all white, right? Marbles and so on. But do you know they weren't white? They were actually colored. They were painted. People actually rub them out. So all of this is there's nation building around this myth. Does that make sense? So whiteness is more than just the skin color. Does that make sense? Whiteness is an ideology, and this is going to sound very controversial, right?
Right.
Because of the imperial nature of Europeans in the instrumentalizing of whiteness. There is whiteness in all of us, and part of the challenge of living in Western society, seriously, is fighting against that notion. So first of all, that whiteness began with, it began in many different iterations, but one major iteration being, for example, and Jesus being model.
Sorry, this is the internet connection.
Sorry.
One of those iterations.
Was the early iterations for you and me, the likes of you and me, was that Jesus was white. And if Jesus is the epitome of manhood and the epitome of the human being, and he is white, already we have bought into that ideology. So part of our fight to anti-black racism, right, must be the decentering and dismantling of the power hold of whiteness.
I knew that having this conversation with you, I would hear something which would like just expand my mind. I didn't expect that.
I
didn't expect that.
There are tons of stuff written on this. I'm not making this up. There's tons of stuff written on that. People talk about how do we have people multiculturalism and people coming together, cohering together? How can we be one under the Spirit? Well, a major part of that is to decenter the throne. Dismantle the throne of whiteness.
And then, and like you said as well, that because whiteness isn't. So when we speak of whiteness, the ideology, you're not just referring to skin color. You're referring to the idea that white automatically means better or supreme. So I think back to, I won't say the person's name, but I still remember it. Someone who I went to school with, primary school. This person, they openly said to me many times, they hate drawing in dark colors. They hate anything brown, black. They hate all of those things. And it just so happened that this turned out to be the first person to ever call me a nigger. So those of you watching, do make those connections how you want to, how you will, but I can definitely see the links. Now, we have just a few more minutes left with you before you come back with Judy. I want to ask you, so given what we spoke about so far and the little gems which you've dropped, I want to ask about the Windrush scandal. So recently, I think in the last 2 years, that was thrust into the center of news stories and news coverage, with the Windrush generation who came from the Caribbean starting, I think it was in 1948. They're essentially stripped of their Britishness, of their legal right to stay in the UK. What can we learn about the ideology of whiteness, or how Britain likes to preserve its British identity? What can we learn about that from the treatment of these Caribbean citizens, or the mistreatment of these Caribbean citizens?
It's really funny, because the first time many people heard the word Windrush was 2 years ago. But the iconic disembarkment of first of all Jamaicans, and then later on other Caribbeans in the same year. That iconic with the Windrush ship that brought over almost 500 people, 500 Caribbeans. That was iconic. That was just iconic. And remember, in 1948 when they came, and this is what I was talking about. In 1948 when they came, they did not come as immigrants.
No.
They came as settlers.
And
how do I know? Well, because up to 1948, every single person in the empire was a subject of the Queen. No matter, and that was over, we're talking about 800 million people. A subject of the, was it 18 million people? So I think it's 800. Anyway, it was a subject of the Queen, right? In 1948, an act was passed in Parliament that made every subject a citizen of the Commonwealth. So even English people and Welsh people and Scottish people, white folk in this island, were called citizens of the Commonwealth, Great Britain and the Commonwealth, which is Great Britain. So when our folk came over, they were citizens.
Yeah,
citizens. They were not immigrants. What was interesting, in the first 5 years between 1945 and 1950, just after the war, 17,000 Caribbeans came over. That's 17,000 Caribbeans came over. In that same time, over 250 Eastern Europeans and a smattering from Italy and Germany came over as well. Not a whisper in the newspaper about them. No protests, no pushback. But in that period of just 17,000 black people came over, there was amazing pushback and telling people to go home and so on and so forth. So already, even though the Attlee government prepared for these folk to come over, they were meeting in say, no, these people can't stay here, they have to go back. So in the mind of the islanders here, the Windrush folk were not part of us. So here was an empire of people. Here was a bunch of people who were closer to British culture. Yeah. Because my parents, they only knew about British culture and British history, right? In their schools, and when they came over as well in the late 50s, that's what happened. Yeah. So here they are, they closer to the culture of Britain, much closer than the Eastern Europeans, much closer than the Germans whom they fought, and the Italians who were fascists, and yet in the minds. People don't. So the history of the Windrush scandal really is the history of belonging. It's the history of belonging, and we still fight that issue to this day. Do we really belong here? The first time I was called an Englishman was when I went to Jamaica when I was 26. Wow. I was playing football. Yeah. And doing my thing. And the Jamaicans went, English, pass the ball, English. And I remember this was about the 5th game. I stopped the game and I held the ball. I said, I'm not English. Because I was never called an Englishman before.
Yeah. I feel as though
I was denied that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because I feel as though so my mum came here straight from Jamaica, I think in either early 70s or late 60s. And for her, it's either you're British or you're Jamaican, but you're never English. And with what you said about with everything you said, and with not really belonging here or feeling as though we belong here as part of the British identity, I think it really speaks to some of the more recent events which have happened and how they came about in terms of ideology.
Yes.
So at this point, we'll section out and bring Abigail and Judy in, who will be able to, I guess, put the icing on the cake of what you've set us up for. But for those of you who do want to hear more from Gifford, and after Judy speaks, when you want to hear even more from her, we'll be able to bring both of them together for a short moment so we can bask in the excellence of their knowledge. So thank you for what you've brought us to so far, and everything I've learned. And I'm sure it will set up, by the end of this, we'll see just how key the things you mentioned are in terms of how we tackle this issue of race. So Abigail and Judy, I think I add them too. Yep. So we have Abigail and Judy here. So we'll just hand off and transition into the next part of that conversation. So I want to thank you again, Gifford, as we
See you soon.
as we'll see you soon.
Thank you so much, Troy and Dr. Rhamie. I take great privilege in introducing Judy Clements, OBE. I have the privilege of working quite closely with her, and she has definitely become somewhat of a mentor for me in navigating the public sector. Judy spent a lot of her career working in the public sector and serving in that area. And one of the key areas that she served in and has worked closely with is the Home Office. So we're going to pick up from there, and you're going to just give me some insight, kind of following on from what Troy and Dr. Gifford Rhamie were talking about, to just understand why we're where we are now. But before we get to where we are right now, let's look at the work you did surrounding Stephen Lawrence. And can you just set the scene for those who are maybe unfamiliar with the Stephen Lawrence case?
Okay, for those of who may not remember the Stephen Lawrence case, I think it was a most appalling, tragic murder of an 18-year-old young black man in southeast London, in Eltham. In 1993, he was on his way home with his friend Dwayne Brooks, waiting for the bus, and then decided to step out into the road to see if the bus was coming. And I think Dwayne had called out to him, "Is it coming?" And some white racist thugs heard the voice and actually approached Stephen and stabbed him several times. And he was fatally wounded pretty much at the scene. And I think that murder defined the way, although it took 5 years before we got a public inquiry. I have to say the Conservative government at the time, when Theresa May was actually chairman of the Conservative Party, they declined to do anything about it. And I was there when Jack told Doreen Lawrence that if they got into power in 97, the first thing he would do is call a public inquiry into Stephen's death.
Yeah.
He was finishing off his A-levels, wanted to be an architect, and his mother set up subsequently a charity into doing that. Very, very painful. I was privileged to be part of the Home Secretary's steering group and saw through probably 5 Home Secretaries over 7 years, beginning to the end, of overseeing all of the 70 recommendations that were by Sir William, I think he's Lord Macpherson now, into how the whole face of policing should change. But it didn't just focus on policing and the failures, because it was bad enough, that tragic murder, but there were 2 major internal police inquiries which failed to prosecute the individual.
Right.
Private prosecution that failed. It was just heart-wrenching that it took such a long time. There are allegations of corruption between the suspects' family members and the police arrangements, panorama. There were numerous documentaries on how this was done. But the first thing they had to look at was the way in which the police tackled racist crimes, and the Macpherson report defined the approach to that. But that didn't mean the police in isolation. There were implications for the Crown Prosecution Service. What was the interesting thing, I attended all the meetings with the steering group, but the one in particular where the DPP at the time, David Calvert-Smith, Lord David Calvert-Smith, High Court judge, was actually brought into the room under severe tension of being told that the CPS had to change with the way in which they communicated and interacted with victims and witnesses. They would just take the case from the police and prosecute it. They wouldn't communicate with the victims. So there were major changes in terms of how the Crown prosecution and the police interacted with victims and witnesses, and also the way the police liaison system worked. When I went subsequently to work at the Police Complaints Commission, I was the lead director for family liaison, because our role there was very different. Family liaison individuals in the police service are normally there to gather more information about a crime in a almost subtle way. Our role at the Police Complaints Commission was very different. It was to support and give information to the family. And if there was anything suspicious, you'd pass that on. It also, the McPherson report, Stephen Lawrence report, had implications for education, because it compelled the education departments, local authorities, to look at training for students in racial inequality and diversity. That was very important too. And one of the things that, particularly linking from what Professor Rhamie had to say, is just remind ourselves of something that came out of the Lawrence report, which was the definition of racism, or of racism, and what it was all about. And the phrase institutional racism, also
very iconic.
Racism came out of that. And I think that's very prevalent today, which is why we have all these studies and all these reports, and we haven't really moved that further forward, again largely because of some of the myths around the psyche and how Black people are perceived, particularly if we want to wear our hair natural or go in a certain way. When Professor Rhamie was speaking of, there was a young lady on X Factor some years ago. I can't remember if she won or was a runner-up, but I remember reading her saying that she was told that if she wore her hair natural, she was unlikely to sell as many records. And I think there was a more recent winner that through COVID was actually talking about racism since the Black Lives Matter. But let us remind ourselves what that definition was, because I think it's very pertinent to everything that's happening around us.
Definitely.
Institutional racism was defined, and there was a time when I knew this off by heart, the collective failure of an organization to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of the color of their skin, their culture, or their ethnic origin. And it goes on to say that it can be seen or detected in processes, attitudes, and behavior that amount to discrimination through prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness, and racist stereotyping, which disadvantages minority ethnic people. And in terms of the criminal justice system, that's what we see. So when I moved from the Midlands, it was to work as the special advisor to the prison service on race and diversity. And then I moved to the Police Complaints Commission. I was headhunted to go there. And I just wanted to just mention three cases that stood out for me in terms of when we think of George Floyd and all of what's happening now. The first one was Sean Rigg, who died in Brixton Police Station. Cardiac, he had a cardiac arrest. What I remember sickening me at the time, having been employed at the Police Complaints Commission, was that we could find that there was no impropriety by the police service. And I found that extremely frustrating, because he clearly had mental health issues. So having founded that, it meant that a lot of organizations like Inquest, for example, and other civil rights movements took up the cause, because often at the Police Complaints Commission at that time, we were known as the toothless tiger. So you would get lots of police shootings, deaths in custody, and police officers were not at all prosecuted in any way. The other one was shooting Azelle Rodney. I remember this very well, where they pumped 6 bullets into Azelle Rodney, who was in the car. He was traveling with 2 other men. And they had observed the intelligence said that they had been observed picking up some weapons from somewhere. But we did find that was an unlawful killing. Again, it took a number of years to get these conclusions. But then we're at the mercy of our wonderful or not, criminal justice system within the courts, because the courts actually acquitted the police officer. So it's very, very difficult. And then the other one, which I took the lead on, was the death of a black paratrooper. And those who are old enough may remember Panorama doing a documentary. This is very painful. It was a black paratrooper, so he had fought for Queen and country. He had had quite a lot to drink, and I think he was in an altercation with, it's not clear whether it was who he was in an altercation with, but he was black and he fell and had severe head injury. Now, this is where you've got criminal justice failures and the health service failures. So he was taken eventually in the early hours of the morning to Leeds Royal Infirmary, where, as those of you who have any idea about health, sometimes when one gets a head injury, you can react in a way that could make others around you feel uncomfortable. And he was kept waiting at the hospital. He was denied an X-ray. The nurse, when he arrived, they didn't take proper notes. The ambulance service didn't do a proper handover to the nurses in aid. So there was the doctor didn't have a track record. Next thing, because he was making loud noises, they called the police and he was thrown into the back of a police van. It is not known what happened, except that he was thrown out of the van into the police station, into the Bain custody area, where within 10 or 15 minutes, he was dead. Before he died, and Panorama showed this, he was actually, I don't know if any of you have been near to someone who is dying and taking their last breaths, which is good. It's quite, and this is what he was actually doing. They ignored him. They were making monkey chants whilst Christopher Older was dying. And that, again, it just took years and years. And what we did was a joint report with what was then the Health Service Commission. They investigated complaints against the Health Service and made serious findings in respect of that. And then I come back to the family liaison aspect about, you know, just about, the shootings, the next, but it's all the other follow-up in the way people are treated beyond the way relatives are treated. Because for family liaison, I remember this very well. I was responsible for keeping Christopher's sister up to date with information. And I remember she would keep me on the phone for hours. But one of the most profound things she said to me was after his funeral, Christopher's funeral, the police rang her up and said, well, by the way, we've still got his brain and some other part. What it was in reality. But this is how people were treated. That's what she said. They had done a biopsy, and I don't know why they felt there was a need to say that to her, either, or not convey that, correctly. But this is the kind of, when we talk about the indifference, the ignorance, the thoughtfulness in the way people of colour have been treated at the hands of the criminal justice system. This is some of my first-hand experience. Has much changed? Well, we tried to implement changes. So, for example, where there was a death in custody, and it, regardless of ethnicity, the first thing we said is to make sure that the family are in touch with certain organisations where they can get their own pathologist. Because often, again, with certain cases, again, Christopher Older, I think they were no less than 4, and I could be wrong, they could have been more, post-mortems on this for different reasons, different stages of the inquiry. So you can imagine what the families go. So what we said, one of the things is families must get, and there are agencies they can go to help them, so that their pathologist could be standing side by side with the Home Office pathologist. So there is one single post-mortem, one where there's a representative from the family, and then, of course, for the state, because all these are under Article 2 of the Human Rights Act.
Human Rights Act, yeah. There's so much in there.
Yes.
There is, at the start of our live, we had some statistics on the screen. One of them was that 3 Black individuals are 3 times more likely to be detained under the Mental Health Act. Another one was Black students are 3 times more likely to be excluded permanently from school. And another one was talking about the statistics around police, and about in 2018, 1.2% are Black. Now, for me, there's a failing ultimately with the system.
Yes. Yes.
And we're going to look at that a little bit more when Dr. Rhamie come back in with Troy. But why do you change take so long? Because one of the things that you mentioned in terms of the reviews for each of these individuals is that the process just took too long. Why do you think that is? And do you think that particularly because it matters to do with race?
No, okay. But I can see why. And the reason I say that was the drug that caused malformations in pregnancy, the big case that was in the news earlier this week, Pamador, I can't remember, took 42 years. 1978, they started protesting. And again, report after report, things being redacted and covered up until finally there was a full independent report which the MP stood up waving, that actually said this drug should have been removed from the market 3-4 decades ago, and that the family should be compensated. Sometimes it's about resources, sometimes it's about the complexity of the investigation, which may not start sometimes for a year or 2 years afterwards, and trying to retrieve information, because all of this needs to be evidence-based. So with the Christopher Alder case, for example, the paratrooper, one of the challenges for us at the Police Complaints Commission was that so many of the officers had retired, and you can't touch them after that. But yet somebody had lost their life, and not to mention the cover-ups that happen. And so information is not often readily available, and sometimes you have to subpoena information and find the right people to talk to. So timeliness is a big issue when the Complaints Commission was set up. And I was going to say that was the recommendation 58 of the Macpherson report, because it was the first independent police complaints institution of its kind in the world, because we used to have people visiting because the precursor to that was the Police Complaints Authority. So although they had independent commissioners, the police force investigated themselves.
It was all internal.
The complaints that came to us, they still do, but it is a lot better.
Another thing I wanted to kind of touch on, I think a big difference between here in the UK and abroad is oftentimes those who are who have these tragic interactions with the police are not just bystanders. They're not just going about their daily interactions. For example, Mark Duggan, he was being followed by the police. What's the real difference, or what's at the heart of that, between the difference between our policing issue over here at the US?
Well, you give me our British policing any day. I still think, despite the challenges, we are by far the best in the world, and we have the systems. They don't always go right, and it looks to me as though there is a need for a further review. Fortunately, there haven't been too many shootings that I can recall now, but even the previous ones, we had the scrutiny of them, but I have to say, and I've also, my first 12 years of working life, 11 years, was as a police officer in a very large force in the Midlands. The shootings, particularly for the Met, are usually as a result of pre-planned operations with intelligence that's been gathered. So they're used to going to that. What transpires when they apprehend a suspect is often questionable, because they will say, I feared for my life. And that, a number of cases, I have to say, would be justified. But then it's following through the process. Was everything done appropriately? What happens with the adrenaline? Mark Duggan was a particularly difficult one, which was after my time. But the Azelle Rodney one, where use of excessive bullets was, I think, a big challenge. We have a more regulated system, oversight body here. What I would like, because I seem to have lost track of whether there are, and perhaps as Adventists we could have a forum that regularly dialogues once a quarter with the police and you know, the mayor's office,
commissioners, and
yes, to look into that, because when I was actually involved in this work, there were lots of conversations and meaningful conversations. So I chaired the Trust and Confidence working group, which was a subgroup of the Lawrence Steering Group, and I was a member of the search. And that was all about rebuilding confidence between the Black community, which is really tough, and the police, because of the total distrust. And it seems that we're back there again. We've got, look, one of our most celebrated athletes, Bianca Williams, and her partner, Ricardo De Santos, and their 3-month-old baby. It seems as though we've gone backwards when I looked at that, and the lack of sensitivity. And again, I thought it was very interesting, the statements they made to say they were driving round on the wrong side of the road, etc. We know that that's, you know, being Black whilst driving, incidentally, a Black, very expensive Merc, you know, and making the racial stereotyping. But what I was relieved to see was that they apologized, and of course it's out of the news now, and heaven forbid for the next one. But something similar happened in Bristol a couple of weeks before, in the middle of the Black Lives Matter campaign, where a couple were just going back home and they'd left their car, a BMW, and they approached them at their front door, and they were so discourteous. But it's good when you've got sensible leaders that say, let's kill this. You apologize and you move on, you know, because at the end of the day, the police still rely on us for information, their work, whatever the color or shade of communities. And I'd like to see us rebuild trust, perhaps because law enforcement is always going to be in my DNA and kind of locking up the bad guys. But they do get it wrong quite often. In America, I just feel that there's a tendency to be a bit too trigger happy, because we've had George Floyd, but we've had a number of deaths since, you know, within a week of it, you know, where they just, painful. I mustn't get emotional. Professor Gifford was really emotional and passionate. but it's
so easy to do so, because we're just human. At this point, I think it's appropriate to bring Dr. Rhamie and Troy back, so we can just get into a small reflection on our current systems in our society here in the UK. So Troy, Dr. Rhamie, let's get into it. Brilliant. So, upon reflection, how do you feel our systems in general, no particular element needs to be focused on, it could just be overall, or any particular one you feel most drawn to, how do you think our systems perpetuate the whiteness that Dr. Rhamie referred to earlier?
I think I mentioned one that you talked about, Gifford, in terms of the psychological perception about the image of what we as Black people should look like. And I think sometimes there's a pressure, particularly on Black women, if you work in corporate Britain, you know, to straighten your hair. And I was giving the analogy earlier, you may have heard, with a contestant who was very successful on the X Factor some years ago, actually saying that she was told she wouldn't sell as many records. So it's not just the criminal justice system, it's not just health, where the disparities are just numerous in terms of getting treatment. There's also, you know, Asian women and issues around cardiac disease and getting access to appropriate healthcare. There's mental health that goes across the spectrum. I think there is a need to not stop talking about it, but actually positively address the community needs. Yeah, I mean, I just think there's a need for, you can never have too much of a conversation, but it needs to be followed by action. Just like all those reports that started under Theresa May, you know, let's go and revisit the recommendations that have not been implemented. The David Lammy report, for example, there's been numerous others about Black people in the workplace. You know, I worry about Black graduates coming out with good degrees, and because of the pandemic, what are the job prospects going to look like? What is the longitudinal studies saying? On top of how difficult a challenge it is if we didn't have the pandemic. So those are the things that's across the spectrum.
I remember, I actually used to do some, Judy, I don't know if you know this, but I actually used to do some diversity work with the police in Brams Hill.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, I did it for a number of years.
Yeah.
And I remember upon my first outing there, I told them an experience that I had with being stopped by the police. I mean, every Black person virtually, especially if you're a Black male, has a story about being stopped by the police in London. And I was literally walking outside a Christian Union shop. I just bought some records. This would have been in the 80s. Christian books. Had my plastic bag, you know, with the Christian Union thing on, you know. And because of the sus laws at the time, you know, they were able to just stop us at a whim. And you know, this guy, and he was very this police officer crossed the room there, and he said, "Oh, you know, what have you taken from that shop?" And so we all had. And I remember a friend telling me, because we used to call them Babylon, you know, we used to call the police. Sorry, Judy, because we used to serve. But we used to call. We used to call the police Babylon.com, you know, or Babylon. And I have a friend who said, you know, the Bible said we should defund the police. I said, no, it doesn't. He said, yeah. If you look at the three angels' messages, it says Babylon is fallen. It's fallen. We need to do. Oh, dearie me. On a serious note, though, I work in education, as you know. And I think, you know, people are comfortable talking on the relational level, you know, there's unconscious bias here, you know, if we just we would maintain more civil relationships and so on. But I actually think it's a lot more. Well, you've already mentioned that. It has to be systemic. And if we're saying systemic, it means then that we've got to, based on what I've said earlier on, we've got to decolonize. And you've got to decolonize the curriculum, we've got to decolonize the academy, and thankfully Newbold is on that pathway. I'm confident to say that we're seriously having conversations about this, and it's uncomfortable. It's very uncomfortable, because if you've never been taught this before, and you've always been taught that your Eurocentrism, or implicitly that the Eurocentrism is really the truth, the way, and the life, all right? For somebody to actually turn around and say, well, wait a minute, the way you teach history of Western thought is very imperialistic. You know, you cannot talk about history of the Western thought without talking about the power of colonialism and the power of imperial thinking, and how that literally saturates much of the historical evolution of Western civilization. Even the very thought of Western civilization, or claim, I should say, of Western civilization being predicated on Greco-Roman philosophy and Greco-Roman civilization is in and itself problematic, because the Greeks predicated their civilization on the Egyptians. And it's clear for everyone to see. They changed the names of the gods. They had Pythagoras and others actually said, that they got their theorems from Egypt and so on and so forth. And to write that out, we've got to write that out of history is what we have to deal with, because this is sheer ignorance. And this politics of ignorance, by politics of ignorance, I'm not talking about stupidity or idiocy, that's on one level. I'm talking about the very fact that the entire narrative that our educational system is built on literally excludes information about the older civilizations, about even the atrocities of the past 500 years. It excludes that, and it creates a politics of ignorance. And people are thinking, no, this is our heritage, when really they haven't got a clue. And I think much of our work today has to be about systemically interrogating structural systems that structure our lives, that structure the way we think. And when we do that, I think we will move some way forward in liberating society at large. And until it happens, we're still going to be, so to speak, enslaved by society.
Yeah, I completely agree. And we want to thank Dr. Gifford, Rhamie, and Judy with I think how you've perfectly summed up not only the wider history of race in Britain, and also how that directly affects in the individual encounters, which unfortunately way too many people of color, especially Black people, do face and do experience at the hands of these systems. And I think so what we're going to do now, based on what you've both just said, we're going to transition into the next part of our program, where we'll speak a bit more about how the wider systems impact us as Christians in our churches, in the different spaces which we are. So I would like to again thank Dr. Gifford, Rhamie, and Judy Clements so much.
Can I just say that as you do so, I hope they deal with the question of colonial Christianity, because there ought to be some defunding and scaling back there too. Okay.
We might have to do a separate podcast with you on that one.
So we'll throw the question out there at least. So, as we wave goodbye to Judy and Gifford, I'd like to invite both Pastor Sam Davis and Anthea into our room with us. And by invite, I'll click on their profiles.
Yes, good evening.
Hi, Pastor. Hi,
Hello. Hello, good evening.
Hello. We're really pleased to have you both with us. We looked at your bios, and Anthea, I didn't realize your dissertation was actually on race and the administration of the Adventist Church. So we're going to really get into that a little bit.
Perfect.
And Pastor Sam, the previous president of a very predominantly Black conference. It would be really interesting to look into your experience and your journey in some respects as well. So I think we'll start with Anthea, and we'll begin to look at what were some of the key elements that you found. No, before we get to that, what sparked your interest in studying grace and our Adventist Church?
Well, I was doing, my whole master's was on Commonwealth and Imperial History. And I'd always been interested in colonialism, in Black history. And I actually had wanted to do a master's in Black British history. And there was no such course in England running, believe it or not.
Wow.
And so I had gone into colonialism. I'd gone to King's College London and decided to do this course, which was quite interesting, although you have to read against the grain, because most of the sources are written by the colonialists, and everybody else is silent. And when it came to writing a dissertation, my lecturer had lots of different interesting ideas as to things I was doing, and a good friend and mentor of mine, Dr. David Trim, when he came back when he heard about some of the things that they were throwing at me, he was like, "This doesn't sound like you. It doesn't sound like you. These aren't your interests." And so he was trying to tease out of me things that I might be interested in. And so we started talking about the church. And to be fair, I had no idea what I was going to discover when looking at race and politics in the church. The time I looked at historically was, before my birth. And so it was, it was very surprising, the things that I discovered. So that's a bit of the history as why I went into what I did.
Before we move on, we've got a couple of questions asking where can they read your dissertation?
And it's a question that I get asked a lot. Well, actually, it is in the New Bold Library, which I hear is shut until January. So that's not very helpful to anybody. But I am at the moment revising it and hoping to publish it in the next few months. I think that there are a lot of lessons, as a young person growing up in the church, I think it's given me the insight to be able to see history repeating itself in many different ways. The church has changed phenomenally. And so I think, watch this space. The next few months, I will be releasing it.
When you release it,
I will do. That's something that I'm planning to do in the next few months. So yes.
So release it before the library opens again. So
well, I must say, my little pitch would be that because of the word count. I mean, I could have, with the amount of material that I got from the archival holdings, I could have pretty much done a PhD on the subject, just with the amount of just the word count. I'm not talking about, I don't want anybody else to be offended who's got a PhD. I'm just talking about the amount of information I had and the scope that I had to stick to. So what I have done is I'm going back through all my research and adding very interesting stories which weren't relevant to the actual dissertation, but I think would be really, really interesting. Such as the conference denying they wouldn't marry a black and white couple because they said they were unequally yoked and so they couldn't get married in an Adventist church. Isn't that an interesting story? Wait for the book. Wait for the book, Abby. So,
All right.
So those kind of things I'm going to go back over and add to it. And I'm also adding another chapter which brings us up to date. So this is where we were, but giving the historical perspective and looking at the church now, and how the dynamics have changed. So it's historical, but there is going to be, a fair amount of social commentary within the historical context as well.
Okay, let's dig into that history.
Yes.
Troy.
Yeah.
I know Troy has some questions, so let's get digging.
So with digging into the history, I'm curious, did you notice any, say, overarching themes and trends across our history, particularly in key moments, for instance, with civil rights movements or around the time when the Windrush generation would come to England? Did you notice any trends? And also attached to that, after you answer, maybe Pastor Sam, if you could speak to see how your experience in church, see if it matched up with those findings. So it's a 2-in-1 question, or possibly 3-in-1 question.
I would say that the church, the trend that I found is that the church, by and large, mirrors the wider society. So whatever's going on in wider society, you find mirrored very closely within the church community. So, you have the influx of I can't, Dr. Rhamie has already said we can't use the word immigration. So we have the citizens arriving to to England 1948 and coming into the church. And what you find is that the Adventist church in that regard is a very unique case study, because you very soon had a situation where there were more Black people within the church than there were of the original host community, which didn't mirror the wider society. And that, for most communities and other historians have noted, that was quite a unique situation. But as racial tensions grew throughout the 1960s and 1970s, you also see that progressing within the church.
Thank you. And Pastor Sam, how was your experience, not only as a church member, pastor, but also a president, in terms of the, I guess, maybe not tension, but the racial, any potential racial issues within the church?
Sure. I think that by the time I became president, which was 2007, Anthea mentioned about the very quick time in which the Black members had outnumbered the whites. So fast forward 30 odd years, and you had a situation where the church was now a majority Black situation. So at the lower levels, you had a situation where in the 70s and 80s, or through the 70s, there was the strong struggle of the membership, the Black membership, to get greater representation in the hierarchy of the church. That was achieved. I mean, the members were militant in achieving that. So by the time I became president, I was one of those who was inheriting the legacy of that particular struggle. So that the dynamics were now changed, in that the host community were the lesser within the church. Okay, so where you had the members of the church gaining Black representation through agitation, through the Pearson package. So by the end of the 70s into the 80s, you now have Black leadership at the South England Conference in the form of Dr. Reed. 1981 was when I went to study at Newbold, and became president in 2007. So you would have had by that time quite a number of years of Black leadership. So the struggle has now taken on another form, in that you have Black leadership, but the Pearson package, which Anthea didn't mention, but the General Conference came down because the laity decided that they would withhold their tithe until there was sufficient Black representation in terms of pastoral leadership. So the mantle of the struggle then passed to the ministers who came on, and the Pearson package made provision for there to be representation at all the tiers of governance. So South England Conference, BUC, and also at TED. And so when you read the historical accounts, you find that the engine, or the organ that was supposed to be overseeing the transition, was actually the TED. So Walter Scragg, back in the day, president of the Northern European Division, was there with the president, and he was the mantle, because remember, TED, or North European Division, is an instrument of the General Conference. So they're then supposed to ensure that at all levels of the church, there is this representation filtering through. And I think that what happened was that where you've got now Black pastors at South England Conference, Black pastors moving up to BUC, it took some time to find out that the BUC, the TED had actually bought out. So they were not willing to accommodate black pastors at that level, the TED level. So it became clear that there was a glass ceiling that was operating at the BUC, and I guess it took us a while to find that out, because it would have to be about 10 years at least to really realize what's going on. But I think that we saw at Newbold College, because remember that the Trans-European Division president is also the chairman of the board at Newbold College. So we have a policy from TED of tolerating blacks, but not really allowing integration at that level.
It's so interesting you say that, because we often think about glass ceilings, now concrete ceilings as they're referred to, within like wider society workplaces. You don't think about it in terms of pastoring and the I guess moving through or climbing up into various offices. A question came in, and I guess this is directed towards Anthea, but I'm sure Pastor, you can speak on it as well. Did your research cover the conflict around black and white conference presidencies and pastoring?
Well, I think Dad talked about it more from from the latter stages. If you want to go back, I think that was one of the big issues. If you're looking at the 1970s, when there's more agitation, the South England Conference was now 80% black, mostly Caribbean, due to the influx from the Caribbean. And they were asking for greater representation amongst their pastors, because although they because I had to do interviews with people who were there at the time, and they said, well, we would go to conference sessions, and although most of the members, or a lot of the members, were black, the pastoral teams were white. The president's white, everybody else was white. And they were saying, especially when you have so many problems in society, they wanted to have more people who looked like them and could represent their issues. And what actually happened is that the SEC then put down a subcommittee in 1975 to look into this issue because of the agitation, and say, well, should we have greater representation? Because they're asking not only just for pastors, but within the conference hierarchy, to have pastors who reflected them. And the subcommittee went away. There were 3 black members and I think 8 white members of the committee. They went away and looked at this issue and came back and said, no, actually the conference is not ready to have further integration at this particular point in time, which directly fed into the idea of regionalism. And interesting, one of the BUC presidents, he said, that actually black people see it as a status symbol to have a white pastor, which, I'm not saying.
Sorry, Troy and I are just baffled.
That was one of the statements. That was one of the. Wait for the book. That was one of the statements that actually was said, and so there was this blocking of the idea of, and you would get there were a few black pastors, and also if you're talking about pastoring, education became an issue because at Newbold you had a quota system. So in any given year you could only have 4 black students at Newbold, and that was the policy coming down from what my dad referred to. He called it the Northern European division, which is now called the TED. So they from the TED have been told, at Newbold we only have 4 black pastoral students at any one time, because they were scared of becoming like the SEC, where you get, swamped. You have words like swamped, flooded, with black.
Those words that you use, just swamped and flooded, as in, were they quotes which you?
Absolutely.
So yeah, I'm doing my best to just like listen and not jump in too much, but it's it's interesting in light of the first part of this conversation with Judy in Gifford, and how he spoke about the ideology of whiteness, how that was perpetuated with, well, I guess like the ideas of supremacy, and not necessarily people walking around with like swastikas in the sense of white supremacists, but the ideology and the dehumanization of Black people, that those words are the words which are chosen because flooded or sorry, what was the
swarmed.
The connotation in my head are like with insects and animals and things which you don't want there when you use those words. So it's
absolutely. And I was around, I'm not sure. I'm sure you're quite young, Troy, but I was around Abby's age. Sorry?
29.
Oh gosh. Wow, you're older than I thought.
Oh gosh.
That's not a bad thing. So I was around Abby's age. Let's start around Abby's age when I'm
watching right now. So
okay. And Mum, don't come for me, please. And one of the, it does shake your faith. But what I do want to interject into the conversation is, if you had a project that you'd worked on, or if you had built something up, and then a group of other people came into that, and all of a sudden they're engaged in something, you didn't have an intention for them to be there. I think I do think there are some racial overtones, but I think some of it is just simply human nature. And as I said to you, some of the things that I've noticed, and then we'll go back to Pastor Davis. Some of the things that I've noticed is that it's not just white people who have done this within the church. I think if you look forward, that now the Black people have become the ones who have built the churches, who have been here for a while, who are established, and we're seeing other groups coming in. So it's very easy to go, I can't believe they said that, how absolutely racist they're seeing us as animals. But it's hard to go into somebody else's shoes and see what it would have felt like to be in this very unusual and unique situation. And that's not to excuse anyone's behavior, but I'm just trying to help us unpackage it from a human perspective.
Sure, I think that's a very excellent point, and one of the things that we ought to be aware of. I mean, Gifford talked about the theology of colonization, and so when you get Black people moving in, they worship differently in terms of their music, in terms of their preaching styles, and so on. So you get this conflict, which is a cultural disconnect. Sometimes, the loud preaching, and our English brothers and sisters, they want to something that's appealing more to the cerebral than to the emotion. And so we've got to recognize that there was some of this disconnect. I saw, as I was growing up, some of the social conflicts. For example, you would have Black members. We would arrive at a conference session, and we would tell the hoteliers, please remove all tea and coffee from the tables because we don't drink tea and coffee. And then our white members would arrive in the night and say, what's happened to the tea and coffee, mate? And so you got and then your Black members would be aghast that they should even dare to think of asking for tea and coffee while we would tuck it into our steak and kidney or whatever it is, or curry goat, or So there were these tensions that aren't racial but are cultural and still exist today. And so I think that when you put any two groups together, you are going to get these cultural disconnects.
Yeah, and I think with those disconnects, I think that dialogue is one of the best forms to address them. So, Pastor Davis, I'm wondering, during your time as president, did you ever feel the need, or was there ever the opportunity amongst the pastors to address some of these issues?
Yes, I mean, I remember going in 1995 to the General Conference session in Holland. And you know, I'm like this. If Troy, if you invite me to your wedding, I'll happily come along to your wedding. And then, you know, when I look at the album, I'll look for you and your wife, the bridal party, and then I'm going to look and say, where am I? Where do I feature in this wedding? You know, where's my photograph? So when we went to the 1995 General Conference session in Holland, I go to the TED stand and I'm looking for pictures of black folk. And there is just a total whiteout. We don't exist, you know, and I found this very offensive because we were now the BUC was now the majority within the TED, yet we were not represented. There was just a total whiteout. And so I remember writing to the incoming president, Bertil Wicklander, making a complaint about the fact that there was this whiteout. When I went to the stand, the TED stand, all I saw was Northern European people, Norway and Sweden and so on. We did not exist. And I remember saying to him in my letter, when I went to the family album, I couldn't see my photo. You know, I couldn't see any of us, what's going on. So he invited me to come up and meet with him. And he said, well, not my fault, you know, not me, Gov. This was the outgoing president, Jan Paulsen, which he was absolutely correct. This was something that Paulsen had done. But I think that we continued with that that struggle for representation, because in 2000, at the General Conference session in Toronto, again, even though they may have corrected that slightly, when it came to the evangelism report, we hadn't done anything within the division, you know, and so I felt so disenfranchised that they have at the General Conference what they call the Parade of Nations. And so you get all these various nations standing up with their flags and so on. So I just jumped up with the Inter-American division for Jamaica, because the TED was telling me, you don't belong. You know, they said you don't belong because of the way we were treated. So I feel that you had a movement started by the lay members in the 70s. The baton was then passed to the ministers to continue with that for fairer representation. And, you know, let me just say this. I think that God has put into every one of us this desire for fairness, this desire for rightness, this desire for justice, you know. So I remember when I was growing up getting beaten, and I wasn't the one who did it, you know what I mean? My parents beat me for somebody else. And there's that sense of injustice, you know, and so we want to see right done. And when seeing what was happening within the division, knowing it wasn't right, and knowing clearly that there was this quota, because we began to see leaders from, let's say, you know, you were the division was now they had a quota of one black, and as long as there was one black at the division, he could not be joined by another black pastor. You had people like Pastor Perry, Pastor McFarlane, who were good leaders in their own right, presiding over a large majority of people, and were passed over by others in lower entities with lesser people taken to the division, which was unfair.
Wow. This has been really enlightening. And I think this is all building up this whole narrative of the systems at play. But we're definitely going to have to come back and have another conversation with you guys so we can dig more into this. Anthea, we're looking forward to the release of your book with the stories. And there is so much more.
Yeah, I just want to close out by
Our time's up.
Yeah, I just want
There's no time.
recognizing.
Anthea, legion.
Yeah, sorry, I just want to
End of this sermon, we're about to wrap.
recognizing the apology that has been given recently by Dr. Beldam and by Rafat Kamal, and we want to see how that will play out in the future, recognizing the wrongs that have been done in the past, and what does those apologies really mean going forward.
Brilliant. It's a perfect transition. Guys, we really thank you for your time, and we're looking forward to dialoguing more with you at another time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
At this point in time, we're going to welcome in Pastor Warren Gillian and Pastor Bernie Holford.
Okay, so thank you again for Pastor Sam and for Anthea. And so here sorry, got a bit muddled there. Yeah, so we're here with Pastor Warren Gillian. Can't speak. I need to have some water today. My mouth is very dry right now. Pastor Warren Gillian and Pastor Bernie Holford. So we're going to try and bring Abby, you were going to say something?
Yeah. Okay. No, go ahead, Troy. Go ahead, and then I'll go into mine.
Okay. Yeah. So we're going to try and bring your experiences together, both as current pastors. And Warren, I think this is, well, we spoke once on Twitter. I believe you commented on something I tweeted about. I was writing a paper about Black theology, like its origins and what it really means. Don't know if you remember this or not. and you did ask for me to send you that essay. I never did, but I want to. If I got first, I would have sent it to you, but I got 2-1, so it stayed in the locker. So I wanted to ask you about, I guess, like yourself being a young pastor. You have this responsibility to your churches, and you see, well, whilst you're seeing everything that's happening in the world, how is this impacting? Yeah, how is this impacting your ministry?
Hey, I just want to say thank you for inviting me into this space and onto this live. To all the organizers, thank you for the invitation. I think when it comes to these issues, sometimes what happens is that when something big happens, we kind of jump on, do the whole performative thing, and then it kind of dies down. But what we're seeing with what we see with George Floyd, with the Breonna Taylor, with Aubrey, and many others, we've seen that this thing is sticking. This is it seems as if this is a watershed moment. So for me, just being impacted by just those videos, those hearing those stories, it's really just kind of took a lot of my headspace. And this is not just because of George Floyd, but this is going back to previous others. And I think it's really just shaped how I do ministry, not just right now, but previously. It's really just altered how I look at the Bible and what the Bible says, and how as just a pastor, when you kind of are in this kind of current position, you often wonder what the Bible has to say about this. And what it really does, it brings me deeper into the Bible, deeper into my faith, to say, well, what does God say about what is going on in my present day? And that's where I am at this moment.
And I wanted to extend the question out to you as well, Pastor Holford. I think it was last week where I'm about to throw in a plug for you as well, Abby. But last week I watched the sermon that yourself and Abby did on seeking justice and social justice in the Bible, and kind of the role that we ourselves play in this. So how have issues of race and racism impacted your ministry as well, Pastor Holford and Abby?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for inviting me onto the program. And I've been raised in a multicultural church in Southampton. As a teenager, we had a whole range of people from all over the world, including from the West Indies there. And I guess I was really fortunate to have a father and a mother who really believed in hospitality across the board, and so showed us as kids and teenagers what it was like to be inclusive and that everybody was equal in the family of God. And that's why when I was growing up and went to my first conference session, I think was about 15 or 16, as a delegate to the Southampton Church, and I was surprised to hear the conflicts that were taking place there, because it was so different from my local church. These were people from London and places like that that had that were polarized, and where Black people were standing up and being very angry, and also there were very, very vitriolic white old pastors who I was ashamed of at the time, for the way that they spoke and the way they responded, and that context of conflict between whites and blacks within the church has perpetuated over the years. And one of the frustrations I've had as a pastor is wanting to encourage the church and wanting to encourage our leadership to explore how we can work together as a united family, as opposed to how to tear each other apart and to really diminish the gospel, and especially our evangelistic potential, because of our lack of ability to talk about race. So I don't know if I've answered all the question, but that's a start of it anyway.
For me, I want to just dig into it a little bit. I know a number of years ago, okay, I say a number of years, it was maybe 3 or so, Warren, when you were at Andrews and you were part of the It's Time, the apology that you and a number of students at Andrews requested from the leadership at Andrews. And Pastor Sam previously just alluded to the apologies that have been taking place more recently, namely from Newbold. How do you think our institutions why do you think our institutions have taken this long to apologize? And how is this kind of connected to their spiritual growth, or your spiritual growth, should I say?
When you speak of institutions, I'm guessing you're speaking of TED or Newbold, our institution.
Either, yeah, our institutions. So our schools, our conferences, our organizations, the whole structure, I guess.
And actually, so just before you answer that, it just popped into my mind. I don't know if we mentioned this clearly. So for those of you who are listening, when we speak about the church, in reference to the church, we're speaking about the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which we're all members of. So just in case there's some viewers who aren't in that belief system, and you're hearing these acronyms thrown about, this is what we're speaking about, specifically the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So Warren, feels Abba.
Yeah, I think it's difficult. Those in our institution, they may find it difficult to do these apologies, because along with the apologies, you also have accountability. You also have the responsibility for reconciliation, and you have the responsibility to make right what you have done wrong. An apology is not simply just I'm sorry, but it is when we look at biblical forgiveness and biblical reconciliation, it's you attempting to right what caused the hurt in the first place. And I think that many of our leaders may not want to take on that responsibility. And I'm glad that Pastor Sam made mention of that apology, and I think it's really to ensure that we kind of hold them accountable, that this is not just a performative marketing ploy, but this is something that we are looking forward to see what you are going to do. I think it is obviously a struggle, because I think here in the UK and Europe, we like to sometimes act as if racism, or we are not the bad folks over here. It's only those in America that it's only what's going on in America that's terrible.
Yeah.
We are good. We are better than what we see over there. And within that false notion, we kind of try to detract away from what our role and in our responsibility, not just in our institution, but just simply in our society. We really don't like to have that responsibility. And I think just from being in any institution, man, it is, I guess it's political in a sense where people don't really like to say that they've done wrong or they've hurt somebody. And I think from a kind of a political point, if I am a man in power, I don't really want to be owning up to the wrongs that I have done. And I think with the TED specifically, in the past there has been some legal issues, and I think they may be trying to steer away from that. That's just a speculation.
Fair.
I'm just really sorry that our institutions have taken so long to get to this place. There have been a number of people who've been advocating for investigation and apology for a long time. The policy that was referred to earlier about limiting the number of black students at Newbold is absolutely racist. There's no justification for it at all. And it created incredible resentment in the black community against Newbold College. And so I've been telling them, I don't want to sound like this is a single-handed thing. There's many people who've been, and Sam Davis isn't as we've heard, is not shy about sending messages, and he's been a good friend of mine over the years, and I'm glad that he's been a champion. Sometimes, for those of you who've done some research, I'm an absolute beginner in this area. But I've heard of this idea of white solidarity, and it's where communities, and in this case, white communities, come together and we stand against whatever others are out there. And there is something about white solidarity that prevents apology taking place. Okay. And it's not until we go through a process where we manage to calm our amygdala hijack that happens whenever we talk about race. It's something that just washes over us. It prevents us talking rationally. It gets down to our core sense of identity and makes it very, very difficult for white people, at least, to talk about race. And so we have to, by the grace of God, find a way of calming down and saying, actually, what's behind this issue? What is at stake? Why are people going and demonstrating on the streets and talking about Black Lives Matter? And it's not because, they've got a chip on their shoulder or whatever excuses we've used in the past. It's because they are hurting. And the reason why they are hurting is because the white majority, those in power at least, have not taken the time or had the attitude, by and large, to be willing to listen to that. And I feel privileged as a pastor of a black majority church where I can't escape that. I remember in one of the first churches I went to down in Portsmouth, my members, young ladies, were telling me how white guys would roll down the window and spit at them as they passed them when they're standing at a bus stop. This was back in the early 1990s. Racism happens around. And I feel that I feel privileged to be part of a church that's trying to resolve that. But my own personal journey over the last few weeks is what we're talking about in that sermon. Was how do I catch up and get up to date and listen in a way that's going to be useful? And in the end, I discovered it starts with me. And I've got to be interested in going onto the internet. I've been really fortunate to have great friends like Pastor Paul King Brown, who've sent me different clips and so on, sent me in the right direction. And so, I bought the book White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, I've tried to get and to understand what the issues are, and to get up to date with the vocabulary, to understand what white privilege is, and it's been a struggle, because I'm human, and the first time someone comes to me and says, look, white privilege, hang on, what about all the poor white people? I came from a Boilermaker's background, a working class background. My grandfather, and so the story goes on. White privilege, that might have been for some people, that wasn't for the working class. But it's not true. Eventually, that we've got to overcome our reactionary nature that denies what other people are saying and find a way of listening to it. And it took me a while to be able to listen to it to my head.
Yeah.
Well, I accepted, okay, theoretically it's possible. And then to go to the next level and to listen to it with my heart and to say, these are my brothers and sisters that are experiencing this incredible trauma. And how will I, as a Christian who preaches regularly about being filled with the love of God, respond to that challenge? And I believe it's doing what this Black Lives, Adventist for Social Justice really is advocating, that we take the side of those that are suffering, even if it's hard to do so.
And so for myself and my own experience, particularly these last couple of months, the majority of conversations I've had with people who are opposing Black Lives Matter movement, even at the and everything around like systemic racism and everything which comes with that, the majority of them have been other Seventh-day Adventist Christians. So in both your positions as pastors, and I guess both, and those roles will involve the teaching, etc., to congregations. How do you reconcile your faith with your advocacy for social justice? Do you see those as being separate, or being something which naturally fits together?
For me, I don't see social justice or any justice as departing away from my Christianity or my religion. I think it in fact propels me to go deeper into my religion, into my Christianity. And it's literally joining with those that we read in the Bible, the lineage of prophets, the lineage of Jesus, or who all through the Bible reaches out to those who are on the fringes of society. In regards to my journey, I think it started in terms of, I guess we're kind of going into the direction of Black theology, or Black liberation theology, or Black theology of liberation. And I guess for me, it really, and that's a whole topic that we can kind of have in and of itself. You've written about it, Troy, but for me, it really started when I guess spending some time in America and going down to 400 West 95th Street in Chicago, where it's a Trinity United Church of Otis Moss, the third, I believe, and just listening to prophetic preaching, just gospel preaching, unfiltered. And if many of you know that was a church where Jeremiah Wright used to pastor. So every now and then I would take that journey down to Chicago to go and listen. And these are, and for me as a pastor and a preacher, for me, I never heard that preaching from that lens or through that experience ever in England. And I said, man, I'm never going to. That's not going to happen for other people. You know, now that I am here in England, you know, we need to be exposed to other lenses other than a Eurocentric lens, you know, and I think that is key. So in terms of the journey, it doesn't, we're just following what Jesus done, man. When he says the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, You know, we're just following the prophet Isaiah when he says, "Learn to do good, seek justice." We're just following Micah, that says, "What does it require of the Lord but for you to do justice and do kindness?" We're just following what the biblical teachings. This is it right here. This is justice. This is what justice is. And I think what the work of Black theology does is that it reinterprets the Bible in a way that balances it in contrast to what whiteness or white people have done in regards to Christianity. Because what whiteness has done in terms of during the enslavement is they've defined justice as a white person coming to save you from Africa, as obey your master. That's what justice is, obey your master. And when this is what social justice, Black liberation theology does, it really forces you to balance just the interpretation away from what we have been taught during slavery, that we are in need of this white savior to come and save us. Black theology talks about how my Christianity and my Blackness intersects. It's about God not just freeing us from sin, not just God freeing us from sin, but God freeing us from the burden of our oppressor. And it's just this idea that God is not only concerned about our suffering, but also the causes of our suffering.
Wow. Pastor Holford, anything to add before we begin to move on into how we can really put this into action?
As I said earlier, I believe our inability to understand and have compassion within our church has prevented us understanding the completeness of the gospel that calls us to mission to serve, and to serve in a united way. And it's my hope and my prayer that by reinvigorating a call to justice, that this will actually precipitate not only much better cohesion and understanding between our members, but the effects of that is that the world will see, they will know us by our love.
Amen.
And the effect of that will be the mission of the church and the evangelism in all of our very, very wide and varied communities will go forth in a way that it hasn't so far.
Wow. I really want to thank you both. I feel like I'm making a lot of commitments, and I feel like I need to have like a podcast Bible study where we just begin to look at the Old Testament, because that's a lot of what you mentioned, Warren, the prophets in the Old Testament, and digging into what justice looked like for them and how we apply that today. So if you'll come back at some point, that would be a great conversation and Bible study to dig into.
Yeah, whenever you know.
Lovely. But thank you.
Commitments.
Thank you both so very much. Really grateful for your contributions and your insight into our spiritual journey and our church and the issue of race. Thank you so much, gentlemen. I'm now going to take the opportunity to invite some very special guests from across the waters, our team of Adventists for Social Justice. So I take great privilege in inviting Tiffany, Jasper, and I believe Veronica to join us in this conversation as we begin to move towards how we can act, not just talk. Hello.
Hi, how are you all doing?
We're great. Thank you.
And how are you all doing? I think in the middle of the afternoon, it should be for you?
Somewhere around there.
About 5 o'clock.
Yeah.
Lovely. So you've kind of heard a bit of the contributions that have happened or that have been shared. What are some of your initial thoughts? Is it what you expected of the UK, or is it not what you expected of the UK?
Yeah, I think for me, it was interesting to hear how much it mirrors exactly so much of the conversations that we are having here. And I had a chance, or I've had the opportunity to speak to individuals who live here who are from the UK and have learned of their own experiences and sort of what social injustice looks like or systemic racism looks like in the UK. So it was just really interesting to see the similarities and hear the similarities across all of our stories.
Right.
Yeah,
And also, I'm wondering. Oh, sorry, no, please carry on, Jasper.
Sorry. I was just gonna say, like, it kind of disabuses your mind that there's somewhere to run, right? Like, there's no like there is no utopia of like peace, and so it kind of, for me, it lit the fire a little brighter, because it's just like the fight is for not just any one locale, but like we're all in this fight together for very important reasons that involve all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. Troy, you were going to share something or ask something.
Yeah, so I was going to ask. So can you let us know what was the spark for setting up Adventist for social justice over in the US, and how has your experience been in the years you've been running?
Yeah, so ASJ, interestingly enough, started in the midst of a moment just like we are in. We came out of police violence happening in our society. In fact, just 4 years ago, when Alton Sterling and Philando Castile were murdered by the police one day apart, we decided at that time that we wanted to, build a group or get together as a group of Adventist young adults at that time to be able to be a part of the protests and the different forms of advocacy that had been occurring at that time. When we thought about it, the other individual that I started the Facebook group with, Jermaine, the church that he attended at the time when Eric Garner died on Staten Island, when he was choked, the I Can't Breathe hashtag came out of Eric Garner's death. His church prohibited the AY, or the youth group at that time, from attending the march in Staten Island. And so we had conversations about that and whether or not this was something we wanted to continue to ask the church's permission to be a part of, or just sort of, stand in our own agency and take the initiative to do something outside of our church, but still in partnership. And that's the route that we decided to take. And so that's how we started. We certainly envisioned at that time just a small Facebook group of our friends who were also passionate about it. But really within 48 hours, the thing had blown up, and we really realized that there was so much interest and passion across our denomination, even outside of the US, for this work. And so that's how we started. And over time, it's been a really interesting journey. We have spent a lot of time doing just what you all are doing here today, talking about the history, talking about the need for this work, really doing a lot of training and helping to reframe social justice as Christian work, as spiritual sacred work. And that's kind of how we have really set up and structured ourselves over the past few years.
So you've been around for 4 years now. What have been some of the biggest challenges? Like, I know you mentioned about churches not wanting to maybe be as active or be seen to be active, but what have been some of the major challenges that you have faced?
I'll start and maybe someone else will jump in. I think some of the major challenges has just been around changing or helping to expand our theology, because within our denomination, social justice has been perceived as secular for so long, as political for so long, that it has been challenging to help people to acquaint themselves with not just scripture that gives us what we need to engage in social justice work, but also the history of Adventism, our early pioneers who were abolitionists, who were very vocal against social justice at that time, and just the other spaces that highlight in the need for true tangible engagement in the community. These have been some of the major challenges, and I like to frame it saying we've spent 4 years building a case for social justice. And so that comes with some of the psychological side, with really getting into how people think and why they think the way they do about this thing, but also the educational, theological side. And so we really had to look at the totality of someone's Christianity and go into all these different sectors to do some educating and some empowering. And it's been a beautiful journey, even in spite of the challenges, because immediately we were able to connect with many of our elders who have done this work, who are a part of the civil rights movement here in the US. And so that's been really, really beautiful. At our conferences, we connect with such a wide range of Christians and individuals who support and are part of the work that we do. But building that case for this work and establishing credibility has taken some time and has been just a bit of a challenge, but certainly not the totality of what we've experienced.
Troy, do you want to go in?
Sorry?
Troy?
I was going to ask for Jasper and Veronica, what would you say some of your greatest successes have been as you've been involved in ASJ?
Veronica, you can go first.
Yeah, I can go first.
All right.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
The successes I think we have had over the years, I was not part of ASJ when they first started, but over the last 3 years that I have been there, I think one of the great pointers or success for us is every year we have what you call an ASJ conference where we go from different areas. And I think that gives us a great opportunity to allow people who probably didn't even know what social justice was, and allow them the opportunity to come to that event and to learn, to participate. And I think that's one of the great things that ASJ has done.
Yes, Jasper?
Yeah. For me, because it's interesting. I wasn't there at the beginning with ASJ, so just a quick backstory. Like as a young Black Seventh-day Adventist, because I was born into the community, the culture. I early on I was very concerned with like race and racism and how it relates, and like I have an uncle who's a 5%er. So your audience may or may not know what that means, but like he really pushed me on the nature of Christianity and it's being a white man's religion or whose religion it was. And so a lot of those struggles, so by the grace of God, I was able to stumble across a lot of the writings of, the pioneers, Ellen White, especially her stuff early on in Volume 1, the testimonies, what she had to say about America, like as it related to slavery and exactly what the function of the Civil War was. I mean, even that's a conversation we're frightened to have now, but I won't digress. But anyway, so my cousin actually tipped me to ASJ a year, I think the second conference that ASJ had, and I was just so excited to hear about a group of young people and older people who were concerned about these things. And so that leads me to like one of the successes that I think was just a lot of Adventists realizing that we don't have to recreate the wheel, but that like our legacy is this concern, right? Like our message. Now that I'm being very careful in how I'm separating like the message from maybe the individuals who claim to be carrying it, but like our message is very much invested in social justice and the implementation of justice. And so for me, as I've been able to preach like in Wisconsin and different places, like that light bulb going off for like many Christians to realize that, or really to be pushed to make a decision, like, are they really going to be Adventist or not? I think is one of the key successes that I think this organization really helps bring to the fore.
So given those successes, in all of your answers so far, you've mentioned things to do with I guess, teaching and educating some members of the church to realize that ASJ, it should be just a part of their Christian life naturally. So how have you been able to, I guess, like mobilize and push the organization forward each year?
How have we been able to mobilize and push the organization forward? Was that the question?
Yes.
I think that we continue to partner with like-minded individuals, and that has automatically and organically expanded the work that we do. When I look at the number of people that I have met for the first time in my life over the last 4 years, just through ASJ, that continues to take us into more and more spaces and really begin to expand our reach. And so one of the beauties of ASJ is that it's very much lay led. And so that gives room for everyone, whether you are a church administrator, pastor, professional, young person, whatever you do, there's a space here in this work for you. And if you are passionate about a particular area of social justice work, then we create space for being able to build upon that idea. And so the organization has just organically really grown and expanded over time. And I think we also, because everyone on our team, and we have about 18 or 19 people in total amongst our leaders between our board of directors and our executive committee, and everyone volunteers. This is volunteer work. No one gets paid for this. This is all the work we do after we do our real jobs. And so that means that we don't really have the luxury of really digging in the way that we would love to. Hopefully we would be able to acquire some funding and things like that may bring us to that space in a couple of years. But for right now, partnering with other organizations that are not Adventist organizations, but certainly doing social justice work and pushing the initiatives that are a part of our goals, a part of our core focus areas, really helps us to get engaged in the work outside of the church that really helps to change systems within our society at large. So the point that we are in right now in ASJ, we've kind of shifted into what can be considered as phase 2, because we've spent so much time doing the teaching and the building of the case, that now we're looking more action oriented. And now we're really looking to turn out our churches underground in tangible areas and connecting with other organizations and actions legislatively, as well as just in our communities. And so we're really at this critical point of shifting into some real tangible work that's exciting.
So what is some of this work that you're looking to do? One of the questions in the comments was asking, why isn't our church doing more for social justice? So what kind of work are you guys doing that we could maybe look at getting involved in over here?
Yeah, I see. What does ASJ stand for? So ASJ stands for Adventist for Social Justice. That's a really good question. So the work is twofold, and I'm sure Vero and Jasper will add to this, in that there are sort of national things that we are looking at as an organization. For example, just looking at 2020 alone, our focus is really around policing and civic engagement. So our goals will be created out of, because ASJ's position is defunding the police, and I'm not sure if that's a conversation that's happening in the UK. But when we look at how we envision our communities, and just really the lack of resources and funding going into programs that can really help restore and rebuild communities, we support the defunding movement. So that means that we have to look at legislation. We have to look at where our elected officials stand and educating ourselves, our members, our churches on these policies that's being pushed through Congress. And how we can be a part of raising our voices and using our collective power to hold our elected officials accountable. as well as re-envisioning and meeting with community leaders and stakeholders and attending community board meetings, town halls, etc., to really hear the needs of the community and then figure out what's the social justice issue in your community as a chapter, and the work that's happening on the ground. And then the other areas around civic engagement, because if we do not engage voting and other aspects of the legislative process, then we're just talking, right? And so we have to really educate our members and our churches on understanding all the different layers of civic work, knowing who your sheriffs are, your DAs, and I know in the UK you all have different names for these things, but the decision makers who are enacting laws and policies that continue to perpetuate systemic racism, we have to be a part of engaging that political process, so that we can see the change that we want to see. And so driving voter registration at our churches, making our churches into voting polls, using our church vans to take people to go vote, all these different things, inviting candidates in so that we can hear their campaigns and the issues that they stand for is critical to where we are trying to go now.
Wow.
So how have you seen the relationship with the churches you've been working with? How have you seen their relationship with their local communities grow as you've been more involved in the social justice activities?
There hasn't been one type of relationship in my experience. My role in this organization, I'm the chapter coordinator. So like I'm in contact with all the various individuals who want to raise chapters in there. And so there's chapters, I don't know, Hawaii, there's some in New York, that like it's all around the country, and now in the UK, right? So like what we're finding is that it depends. Like there are some churches that I wouldn't call hostile, because I don't know, I'm trying to be nice, but like there are some that are a little suspicious and they're wonder, but then there are some chapters who have like the full support of the church, and so there isn't a monolithic response, interestingly. And that seems to, this is anecdotal, but it seems to fall along lines of largely what those individuals, so you'll get pushback from some, and it seems to depend largely on what people understand the Adventist and Adventist for social justice to mean, more than the social justice part. Like it, so I have been told, like, the concern should just be to preach the gospel, and that gives an idea that that seems to suggest that particular Adventist sees justice and gospel work as mutually exclusive, right? Where you have some who have a different idea. And so like it is very interesting, the spectrum of response, but there is no one response that has been happening with the church at large.
Right.
I just want to add something. I think during the process, what's important is partnership. Allowing churches, community organizations to partner with you and allow them to build trust and a relationship with you, that they can trust the vision that you have brought. Make sure you have the church with you, because if the church is not with you, you'll have a lot of negative feedback and stuff like that. Because I think with us the earlier part, it took us a little while to get some churches, really on board with what our ideas were and how we were looking forward to getting ASJ in a year, 2 years from now. So partnership, trust, all these things are good.
I think that's so key, particularly as we're looking to start.
Yeah.
And this is what the shift was really about. It's a shift in mentality. It's a shift from seeing the gospel and justice as two separate entities when they're really all in one. I think over here we have more of a delayed response. If you heard all the things that Judy and Gifford were talking about at the very beginning, like in our wider society, we have issues. In our church, we have issues. These are all systemic issues that have been embedded into the fabric of how we've done life over here. But it's time to change. So I think I would really like Tiffany to just, I've seen the word and heard the word agitate throughout this conversation prior to you guys speaking on your website. So I want you to tell us, what does it really mean for us to agitate as Adventists for social justice?
Yeah, I love the word agitate. We kind of co-opted that word from Pastor Wesley when he preached at one of our conferences, Pastor Wesley Knight. And he really dug into the word agitate for us. And, you know, agitating is really just raising the alarm. It's really putting a spotlight on an issue. It's utilizing your voice to speak out, or like Pastor Jamie Colasar says, to raise your voice. And so, you know, we have to agitate. Nothing, when we talk about systemic racism, we're talking about power. We're talking about deep-rooted historical dehumanizing of a people, white superiority, etc. These power systems are not just going to give that up for us, right? Like, we are not just gonna sit and talk about it and be cute and think that they are going to just kind of say, all right, we hear you. No, it's going to take some real moving and rumbling and speaking out continuously. And even what we see happening and what has happened here in the US over the last few weeks, the marching, the rallies, even the fire. Am I saying go burn things down? No, I'm not. But burning things down is a part of agitating, right? And it's been very interesting to see that after those forms of agitation occurred, so many things that we have been asking for and begging for years and years and years just started to happen, right? And so agitation has a place. There's certainly a need for agitation, but I also like to highlight that I don't believe everybody's called to agitate. And so I think it's really important in doing social justice work for us to know what our positions are and what our roles are, because agitating, speaking aloud, like God says in Proverbs, is not the gift or the call of everyone. So I break it down into 3 different areas. Some of us are called to be agitators. Some of us are called to be innovators. And some of us are called to be orchestrators. And so it's really critical that we know where we fit, because when those who are agitating are raising the alarm on an issue, we need the innovators to be working on, well, what are we going to do differently this time? How are we going to strategize and organize? And some people are directly gifted to do that. And then other people are directly gifted with the orchestration piece. How are we now going to implement this, make it tangible, make it real and practical? And other people are gifted to do that. And so if we are all trying to be agitators, then the rest of the work doesn't get done. And so when we talk about agitation, we really have to be clear on what we are called to do, what area of the work God is putting us in. It's going to be based on our gifting, on our passion, on our talents, so that we can really move things forward. Because right now in the US and really across the world, while those who are rallying and protesting is doing their part, there are others of us that have to be organizing and strategizing and really laying out the vision and making it clear. So I think we just all have to really know where we fit in.
That's so important. That is so important. We're going to wrap it up here because time is just flying by. But we really thank you for the encouragement that you've given us and the direction and guidance that you've given us. And we're looking forward to working with you. At this point, what was that, Troy?
I said 1,000% looking forward to working with you.
At this point, we think it's so important that we don't just end the conversation here. It continues. So if you've been looking at the comments, you will see, for our audience, you'll see that there is a link in the comments. It takes you to a website called Start Our Shift. And what we want you to do is we want you to just put your email in, put your name in and put whether you want to be an agitator or a liner. Now, we've divided them in two sections. An agitator, at present, you know you want to be about the action. You know you want to get involved. We're working on some things. And if you've been following the news, you would have seen that the Labour leader, one of our politicians over here, he has said that he's going to undertake unconscious bias training. So our first action as a team, we've decided we're going to write a letter to the other political leaders, encouraging them and calling them to also go on unconscious bias training. We think it's important that it's not just one of them, because he's not the one actually leading the country. We need all of them to be involved and actively ensuring that they're doing their part to help everyone. So this is our call to you. As we said, we don't want to just talk. We want to build a relationship. We want to get to the point where in the UK, we have chapters established that are doing the work, that are really, as Tiffany said, that are orchestrating, that are innovating, and that are agitating, because all three are so important. And so whether you feel at present you just want to keep in touch with us, that is also important as well. We're going to start sending out a regular newsletter just to let you know some of the things that are in the news, some of the petitions that are going on. Next year we have a census, and so often our Black communities, we do not participate for fear of migration concerns or for fear of tax concerns or whatever it might be. But we are encouraging you to participate on all levels of the civic engagement. So it's on you. We've invited you to start the shift with us, but we need you. So don't go and just leave the conversation or leave the video, but get involved. Sign up on our website, and we are so looking forward to dialoguing and getting things moving in the UK with you. Troy, I'm going to hand over to you so you can wrap us up.
Okay, so I want to thank, and I can't thank you all enough. I want to thank, first of all, everyone who has tuned in to this live, who've been here, especially those who've been here from start to finish. Those of you who had to drop out because you have work in the morning, we fully understand, but you'll hopefully watch this back later. I want to thank Dr. Tiffany. I want to thank Jasper, and I want to thank Veronica, representing Adventist for Social Justice, and joining us and with their guidance and sharing their experiences. And I'm sure that we'll be working closely with each other in the future. And I also want to thank every single one of our guests who have been on. Abigail and I have had to make a few promises that will have people back, that we can just dive into their topics further. We've put a lot into these 2.5 hours, and my hope is that you also got a lot out of it. So as we're about to sign out, as Dr. Tiffany, Jasper, and Veronica are going to finish the rest of their day in America, and as we're about to go to sleep here in the UK. Today we have started the conversation, but everyone in the UK, Adventists in the UK, we're asking, are you going to start your shift? Together, will we start our shift? If that is you, and I'm trying not to get a bit preachy here, but if that is you, you see in the comment section below the website to startourshift.com. Sign up to be either an aligner or an agitator as we take steps to move this action forward as we start our shift. So I want to thank you all again and bid you all good night and good afternoon.
Yeah, my pleasure. Good to be here.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, God bless y'all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.